Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 11th in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. I've pointed out in this series that there is a consensus among the famous thinkers that there are both positive and negative traits in human nature. Yes, we are capable of compassion, love, and goodness, but we are also capable of envy, hatred, and happiness stealing. I've been dealing with the question, can anything significant be done to get human beings to behave more decently towards each other? Perhaps the single most important thing that might be done is to try to increase compassion in the world. Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher, and other famous thinkers have commented that all morality is based on compassion. Compassion, of course, begins with empathy, the ability to identify with others, the ability, so to speak, to walk in someone else's shoes. Thoreau put it this way: could a greater miracle take place than for each of us to look through the other's eyes for an instant? He went on to say, I know of no experience so startling and informing as this would be. Can anything be done to increase people's empathy? Well, education, religion, the family, the media can all work to increase empathy. How so? By the message that suffering is universal. Yes, life does have its sweet, joyful, tranquil moments, but life also has its bitter, sad, anxious moments. No one can avoid them. I mentioned in my last program an apocryphal story concerning the Buddha. Some woman whose young child had recently died and approached the Buddha and asked him to bring her child back to life. This despite the fact, by the way, that the Buddha never claimed to be divine. In any event, according to this story, the Buddha told the woman to go door to door in her neighborhood to find a family that had not experienced any suffering, and then to report back to him on this family, and then he would attempt to bring her child back to life. Of course, the moral of the story is that it was impossible for this woman to find any family that had not experienced suffering. Longfellow put it this way: if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. It has been said that compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. In my last program, I recounted some of the suffering of famous historical figures, such as Shakespeare and Lincoln, and also the suffering of some contemporary and near-contemporary figures, including celebrities and athletes, such as Marilyn Monroe, Mickey Mantle, Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth, etc. An important question: if schools and colleges in literature, psychology, and philosophy classes make students more aware of the pervasiveness of suffering in the world, won't this tend to make students and other young people very pessimistic? Well, first of all, sensitive children and teenagers already are aware of much of the suffering in the world, and indeed of the suffering in their own lives. Secondly, it can be comforting. It can be comforting to know that one is not alone in one's suffering. Thirdly, it's been said that if one begins with the premise that life is difficult, it will all be much easier. And also, young people can be better prepared to deal with the adversity in their own lives, and to realize that some of the satisfaction in life Indeed, some of the joy in life results from dealing with obstacles. Also, if one begins with the premise that life is easy, it will all be much more difficult. The great thinkers also have commented on the connection between wisdom and suffering, the idea that suffering can help lead us to wisdom. Aeschylus, the famous Greek dramatist of antiquity, put it this way, and I think this is a profound, thought-provoking quote. God, whose law it is that he who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the human heart. And in our despair, against our will, wisdom comes to us by the awful grace of God. It's been said that how we live in the world depends on our willingness and ability to empathize with others. Empathy can set in motion a chain reaction. Empathy can lead to compassion, compassion to morality, morality to service to others, and service to others to joy in living. Remember Schopenhauer's comment that all morality is based on compassion. Again, Schopenhauer and so many of the great thinkers have said compassion is the real moral incentive. Is it possible that very uncaring, dishonest people in business, education, and politics have little or no empathy and therefore little or no compassion for other people? What do you think? What are the obstacles to cultivating compassion? Well, I think one of the obstacles is appearances, the role-playing, the mask-wearing that many individuals engage in. Many people, men especially, I think, often pretend to be happier than they are. Again, they're engaging in role-playing and mask-wearing. M. Scott Peck, the famous psychiatrist, has put it this way: most people opt for lives of very limited honesty and openness, hiding themselves from the world. Also, I think another obstacle to cultivating compassion are all the smiley faces in TV commercials, print advertisements, and sitcoms. What are some of the consequences of not cultivating compassion? Well, Schopenhauer, whom I've quoted earlier in this program, claimed that as we grow older, one of two characteristics will come to dominate our disposition: either compassion or envy. Compassion or envy. He believed that envy so often was based on an individual's overestimating how happy other people are and underestimating how much suffering each person does in this world. The Tao Te Ching, the famous Chinese book of wisdom, also comments on the penalty people pay for being envious and the comfort that may result from being compassionate. The Tao Te Ching puts it this way, and I'm quoting from this famous Chinese book of wisdom: heaven arms with compassion those whom she would not see destroyed. Heaven arms with compassion those whom she would not see destroyed. What are the consequences of envy? Well, personal discomfort. One cannot be envious and happy at the same time. Also, I think it's fair to say, so often envy can lead to attempts to steal other people's happiness. After all, to the person who is devoid of any compassionate feelings, other people are nothing more than objects in this world. If compassion can make people more moral, can it be taught? I think the answer to that is yes, and I think it can be taught in many ways. One of the ways it can be taught is by example. I can recall when I was 12 years old in the 7th grade, my class, with our teacher, Mr. Alter, took a bus trip through Manhattan. It was a tour bus, and the tour guide pointed out the sights in Chinatown, Little Italy, the area of the United Nations, the Upper East Side, etc. And I recall that when we went through the Bowery, our tour guide referred to some of the down-and-out men lying on sidewalks, some of them intoxicated, I think, as drunks and bums. He used those words. And I recall that when we returned to school the next day, my teacher, again in the 7th grade, Mr. Alter, kindly criticized the tour guide. He said that those words drunk and drunks and bums were inappropriate words, that we should have compassion for these men, not knowing what had driven them to live the way they lived. So Mr. Alter, by his example, by his words, was teaching 12-year-olds about compassion, about empathy also. Also, I think empathy and compassion can be taught by studying history. Tolstoy said the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. Perhaps the best way of cultivating empathy and compassion in people, besides the ways I've already mentioned, is through literature and drama. Indeed, linguist Noam Chomsky, who teaches at MIT, has said we will probably always learn more about ourselves and other people through novels than through science. Books such as Lord of the Flies, Huckleberry Finn, and another book entitled Black Like Me, and so many other books, so many classics in terms of numbers running into the hundreds, maybe more than 1,000. Also, another way I think of cultivating empathy and compassion in people is by having students study the great humanitarians. People such as William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist prior to our Civil War, a man who campaigned very courageously for the abolition of slavery in the United States. And it took great courage to do this. It took great courage even in the northern part of the United States to do this. In fact, some abolitionists were killed. The idea was they were making waves. They were causing problems by speaking out against slavery. Other humanitarians, people such as Oskar Schindler, the famous German industrialist, non-Jewish German industrialist, who saved at least 1,300 Jews during the time of the Holocaust. Again, he was a very rich German and put these Jews to work in his factories. And he told the Nazis that these Jews were doing work indispensable to the Nazi effort to win World War II. And also, he bribed many Nazis not to harass the Jews that worked for him. And because of Oskar Schindler's efforts, the lives of more than 1,300 Jews in Germany was spared. Well, I think students should be asked the question, what motivated the abolitionists in America to campaign for the abolition of slavery? As I mentioned before, it took great courage to do that. What motivates the Oskar Schindlers of the world? What motivates the political dissidents in the world, fighting for democracy in some very totalitarian countries and often risking their lives to do so? Well, Schopenhauer answered his own question as to what motivates these people. He said what motivates them is compassion, fellow feeling. Also, to promote decency and kindness in the world, I think it's fair to say that schools and religions and other social institutions must help people to become more introspective about their hatred, their anger, their jealousy, their power trips, and also about their feelings of inferiority and inadequacy, and what often are the consequences of people's feelings of inferiority and inadequacy. Adlerian psychology is based on the idea that feelings of inferiority are a prominent trait of human nature. Adler believed that most human beings, if not all human beings, have some feelings of inferiority and inadequacy. In fact, here are Adler's own words. Again, psychiatrist Alfred Adler. Human beings are very sensitive media for the development of inferiority complexes of all kinds. He went on to say there are multiple causes of people's feelings of inferiority. He believed that in most cases it begins when we are very young, when we are toddlers and children, looking up to adults who are much bigger physically than us and who can control our lives in many ways. Adler went on to say this, and again I'm quoting him. It is the feeling of inferiority, of inadequacy, which determines the goal of an individual's existence. Adler believed our feelings of inferiority can lead to good things as well as bad things, depending on how we deal with these feelings of inferiority. For example, if one wants to compensate for any feelings of inferiority one has by becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher, or a carpenter, or a building contractor, with the idea that one not only wants to make a good living, but also wants to render service to humanity, Adler would say that's a fine way of dealing with one's feelings of inferiority. But if one wants to become a doctor, lawyer, teacher, building contractor, carpenter, what have you, simply to make money and to cultivate social status, with no thought of rendering any service to humanity. And in fact, if one is even willing to do morally questionable things to achieve one's position, then Adler would say that's not a good way to compensate for one's feelings of inadequacy. Adler talked about the idea of social feelings. That's his term, social feelings. And he claimed that if we try to compensate for our feelings of inferiority, and if we have social feelings in doing so, the outcome is likely to be good for society. But if we have feelings of inferiority, not coupled with social feelings, then the outcome of our efforts to deal with our feelings of inferiority is likely to be deleterious to society. I think it's fair to say that schools and religion can all do a better job in educating people about human psychology, about our feelings of inferiority, for example. Adler believed that people deal with their feelings of inferiority in many ways, and that one of the ways they often deal with their feelings of inferiority is to try to compensate for those feelings by power trips, by trying to exercise power over other people. Adler, of course, believed the best way to compensate for one's feelings of inferiority is to try to be an honorable person. Confucius put it this way. Confucius said, the most important thing a person can accomplish in life is to try to be a good human being. And Beethoven, the famous composer, put it this way, and I'm quoting Beethoven: I recognize only one sign of superiority in mankind, and that is goodness. Adler emphasizes, again, the idea that many people, unfortunately, try to compensate for their feelings of inferiority by questing for power over others. Here are his own words. The goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others is the goal which directs the activity of most human beings. What do you think? Adler and others have given many examples of how people quest for power over other people. Race and ethnicity have often been at the root of this. Whites questing for power over blacks. Blacks in Africa questing for power over other blacks. Whites in Europe, such as Napoleon and Hitler, questing for power over other whites and conquering other countries inhabited predominantly by white people. And of course, in Asia, yellows questing for power over other yellow-skinned people. Japan, for example, took over parts of China and often treated the Chinese very cruelly. We know religion has been another area where people have quested for power over other people. Christians questing for power over Jews and Muslims. Christians questing for power over other Christians. Catholics over Protestants. Protestants over Catholics. In India, Hindus have quested for power over Muslims. And in Iraq today, some Muslims questing for power over other Muslims. The Shiites and the Sunnis, for example, questing for power over each other. Important question. Do you think there are clergy, priests, ministers, rabbis, and imams in this world who are much more interested in exercising power over other people than in trying to promote love and justice in this world? Again, what do you think? Of course, sex has been another area where people have quested for power over other people. Men over women, heterosexuals over homosexuals. The family, another example. In fact, the family can be a hotbed of power seeking. Not only husbands over wives and vice versa, but siblings questing for power over each other, not to mention in-laws who want to control one's lives, even how one thinks. And of course, needless to say, the workplace can be an area where we often see people questing for power over others and questing for an unnecessary kind of power over others. Power trips, of course, are not fundamentally satisfying to the soul. Adler raised this question: how does the mentally healthy person deal with feelings of inferiority and inadequacy? And Adler's response sounds so much like something Jesus or Buddha would say. Adler claimed the best way to cope with one's feelings of inferiority and inadequacy, the best way to compensate for such feelings, is trying to be a decent human being. Adler claimed that trying to be a decent human being is much more satisfying to the soul than is questing for power over other people. Adler also claimed that trying to be a decent human being is good for our mental health. Aristotle put it this way: trying to be a decent person helps us to be friends to ourselves, and it makes it easier to grow old and die. And remember Beethoven's comment, which I mentioned earlier in the program. Beethoven, on the concept of what makes a person superior to another person, said this: again, I recognize only one sign of superiority in mankind, and that is goodness. We are a nation obsessed with statistics, sports, government statistics, SAT statistics. So many students are obsessed with their SAT scores. And of course, the SAT scores have to do with percentiles. So after taking these college board examinations, you find out whether you're in the 77th percentile, the 5th percentile, etc., of all the students who took the exam. Well, wouldn't society be much better off if people want to introduce the concept of the decency percentile, if society would emphasize the concept of the decency percentile, if people were more concerned about where they might rate in terms of decency rather than where they might rate in terms of their College Board scores. I've mentioned before that so many of the great thinkers claim that a sign of intelligence is to act decently. So many of the great thinkers claim that when we do evil in this world, we are acting unintelligently. Among the thinkers who claimed that were Buddha, Jesus, Plato, among many others. Indeed, as you know, the Buddhists believe in the concept of karma, the law of consequences, the idea that when we do good, we will be rewarded, and when we do evil, we will be punished, in this life as well as in future lives. Again, that's the Buddhist concept. Do you think it's possible that some outstanding college students may have a very high SAT percentile, but a very low decency percentile? Of course, integrity cannot be certified by academic degrees. And I think it's fair to say that it's unfortunate that some of these people, again, who rate very highly in terms of SAT percentiles, but very low in decency percentiles, often occupy power slots in politics, education, and business. I see I'm running short on time. I'll continue to pursue this theme in my next program. But right now, I would like to close, as I usually do, with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in his masterpiece, Walden, reminds us that we are all artists. Thoreau said this: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."